Okay, good morning everyone. Today we have the second session of the technologies, which is going to be dedicated to communications, and communications is again one of these human functions that has been externalized following the interpretation from McLuhan about media, and has become in itself a whole background in which we need to interact with something that used to be originally inside of humans or inside of human communities, but has acquired a certain level of independence to some degree, to which we need to think about when we talk about or when we think about cities. In this case, the history part of this section has many things in common with the section on sensing on Friday, because obviously one of the interesting things about sensing was that what these artificial sensors were measuring or were scanning was communicated somehow, was connected to other entities, to other agents in the urban process. And so in this, it is very closely connected with the sensing, and you will see that there are several slides that also repeat some of the concepts that we saw on Friday. And as I was starting to say, I mean, I'm sure that there are earlier forms of communication, human communication, mediated human communication, like, I don't know, doves and other things. But in this case, because we are mostly talking about cities, the history is actually not that deep, or at least I haven't really found very relevant examples. And I would like to start almost like in the 19th century with the kind of historical references, but there are actually not very many, and they are not very relevant to the situation where we are now, considering all digital communications, etc., etc. So probably the best example that I can think of about mediated communications in urban environments is the post. The post is obviously a mechanism that enable people in the 18th century, 19th century to communicate with each other at a distance, but it happened that that communication intensified in a certain way and registered the connection between two different humans or two different human agencies. And so the post was obviously a mechanism that happened in the developed world. I don't know, I actually, you may be able to help me here, because, and I encourage you all to help me, because it may be that in this session, which is basically about social media and things like that, you know more than me. And but you may also know more about what were the post services in Asian countries, which is something I haven't really researched, and it may be so. I'm here showing England and the US. Again, it's a little bit of a kind of Anglo-centric perspective of the world. But I think what is interesting about looking at these mechanisms that people used to communicate with each other in the past is that these systems had a recognizable form, or a recognizable shape, recognizable color. I mean, the case of London, of England is very interesting. No? That in a city that was mainly made out of stone and these kind of, in a way, natural textures. Suddenly you have these things that are made out of steel and are painted in bright red, and so they appear in the in the urban landscape, and this was the U.S. Postal Service, which was much more, in a way, discreet, but still what you see is the emergence of a whole infrastructure that appears in the urban landscape, and I think that is interesting, and maybe something that doesn't happen now. There are interesting things that started to happen, particularly in the US with the Postal Service, which is that, for example, they developed almost like avatar systems, which were the post office boxes. So you didn't need to even have a fixed address as a recipient of or as a participant in these communications, because there was a mechanism that the post offices had that enabled you to rent almost like an urban address that was not your real location. So you were allowed in some ways to move around, but you had a virtual avatar in the post office. And that may also, I mean, all I'm going to say is to keep telling you maybe some interesting things that you can think about, but there is that interesting side about the post boxes. And as I said, these elements appear in the urban field in a very prominent way and shape the urban landscape. I mean, and you can also relate it in the case of England, which is, again, I would say, because of the Industrial Revolution being generated there. Maybe the society that first engage with these kind of devices, and London in particular, it is very interesting, no? Because there are a number of things that form part of the collective realm of the city, which have a little bit this nature. No, you have black cabs, you have red buses, you have red post boxes, and these systems are somehow calling for attention in the urban field. So they manifest themselves physically in the city. Now, these ideas of mediated communications between humans took different forms in the 19th and the 20th century. This is a system of pneumatic tubes. I don't know whether you have ever seen one of these systems, or you can find any of them here in Seoul, but in the States I have seen the remnants of them. So office buildings in the past had these systems that, from this room, which was the post box in the building, they would get the letters and they would put them into little tubes, plastic tubes, and they will put the plastic tubes into these. So the building was provided with a whole network of pneumatic tubes that would send the messages from the post room that was receiving and sending letters outside to the people in the office. So every department or every person in the building would have one of these things that would this is the kind of tube that where they were putting the letters on. So you compare that with an email, like in an office today, you would be working and you would be sending emails to your colleagues or to other people. But before, every one of these messages, even in highly sophisticated environments, like expensive office buildings, and they used to have had these kind of systems that actually were even planned at the time in larger scales. This is a project that was actually not built in London, where the density of communications at the time, we are talking about mid 19th century, 1863, I think this project is. So it was supposed to be something similar to what was installed in the buildings, but installed in the city. So there was a tube, relatively large tube, that carried these vehicles that were pushed by air, by a pneumatic. So it was literally a translation of the pneumatic tube systems in buildings, and was aimed to distribute the post in central London. So that was a real project that was not built, but it was not built in this form as a kind of pneumatic system that had no driver, no human control, but it was actually built. I actually haven't seen this in London, but I know it's there and you can visit it. It's a kind of museum now, and it was not built in the form in which it was conceived as a pneumatic tube. So it was more like a railway, underground railway that was built in central London, and that was almost like a conventional, railroad in the 19th century. So it does exist, and it was built, and I think it can be visited to a degree in London. But so the density of this communication in an important city back then, like London, took such scale that justified the construction of a tube that was carrying mail from Euston Station to Liverpool Street Station, and stopping in a number of other centralized post offices. So then we look at a different type of communication, which is not a peer-to-peer communication that is mediated by these systems, but is one monodirectional type of communication, which was originally associated to cities, which is basically newspapers. So originally newspapers were in some way systems of collective communication in which one agent, which was the newspaper, which usually was associated to Los Angeles or Boston or Chicago or New York. I mean, that's why all these newspapers are named by the name of the city. So they were devices that started to establish a collective communication, and that's why I believe that communication is certainly a common, in the sense that is one of these elements in cities that bring people together in the and create some sort of collective intelligence and collective purpose. So the first broadcasting systems were associated directly to cities, to physical enclaves. Although then, you know, New York Times or Los Angeles Times, they became global, they became national. So the important cities started to, in some way, transcend their boundaries in terms of that collective intelligence, and almost like colonize other cities or other territories in the countries where they originated from. Then we move to other communication systems, the telegraph, which was invented by Samuel Morse in 1844 and had already been developing since the 1830s, so almost like mid 19th century there were these systems using electronic inputs to reproduce text, to reproduce letters. So there was a kind of translation, and the question of language, we'll see it is important here, but there was a mechanism that translated electronic impulses to letters, and that kind of association obviously enabled to reproduce a text at a long distance. And again, it was a peer-to-peer communication. It was not a monodirectional form of communication like newspapers, but it was a mechanism that enabled individuals to communicate with each other. And from there, obviously, we moved to the telephone. So Alexander Graham Bell, also in the second half of the 19th century, invented a mechanism that enabled to translate directly sound through, or convert sound through an electronic vibration through a wire, through a cable, to another recipient, and that enabled you to talk to somebody else who was not. So what we see is that the act of communicating, which is a very kind of primitive human capacity of that used to require physical presence, is suddenly broken. So people can communicate with each other without being in the same location, and sometimes, obviously in kind of later developments of phone systems, even communicate across continents. But these the phone system plays almost like the opposite role of the broadcasting systems. So it allows to establish communities that are not sharing the same space. So in some ways, having phones in their original application probably reinforce the capacity of citizens to communicate with each other, and probably the communications were mostly occurring in a city, in a kind of physical domain, physical enclave, as opposed to but then basically became extended to an increasingly large capacity to produce that communication across very huge spaces, huge distances. So, but in some ways, what you can imagine is that the phone or the telegraph enable communication outside of the city. So in some ways, break down or play against the relevance of that proximity that originally created urban settlements, and enable to people to communicate outside of these locally bounded settlements. Next invention there is the radio. So as opposed to electronic vibrations that are conducted through cables, the radio explored the possibility of electronic vibrations that are conducted through the air, and that obviously produces newer capacities. The original broadcasting systems were limited also spatially, so they were associated to cities or to communities or to enclaves, because the radio signal had a certain reach, and beyond that reach either you install repeaters or mechanisms that enable to replicate the signal and to broadcast it further. But originally radio stations were also associated to certain communities, and even today there are many radios, or most radios have a limited physical reach, unless they are very, like BBC then kind of broadcasts everywhere, but the original radio systems, which were another monodirectional communication like newspapers, so there is one agent that is communicating simultaneously with many different agents, more or less in the surroundings of its location. So the radio broadcasting systems like the newspapers were allowing for that collective communication to take place, and that collective communication was originally related to an enclave, but then went further and transcended the urban boundary or the community boundary. And from there we basically moved to television, and television was obviously a very important communication system that in the 50s and the 60s in certain cultures radically transformed the capacity of a certain community to share information and to be, obviously it was information that was broadcast by one agent, or maybe by a number of channels or agents, but it was a monodirectional communication that constructed communities. And there are people who are saying that, or the theorists who deal with these things. Marshall McLuhan was obviously the main theorist of television and broadcasting systems, because he was theorizing about something that was contemporary to him, which was the fact that for the first time a whole generation of people, not only in the US but also in Europe at least, I don't know what was the reach of these systems, or the penetration of these systems into Asian countries, probably smaller, and I don't know, again, it will be interesting because the history that you see of these systems is very Western driven. I don't know what were the earlier versions of these in Asian countries. If we were doing a proper seminar, maybe somebody could do that investigation and see how they develop. But what McLuhan says is that there is one generation, which is the kind of 60s generation, that grew up in the West, subject to or related to a very consistent body of information that was being broadcasted by, so everybody knew certain characters, everybody knew, and that is actually obviously an incredibly powerful form of shaping a community. That a community that, in the case of TV, because it became so powerful, transcended the boundaries of the cities. So we see how these broadcasting systems that in some ways were conducive to establish a very strong community link between people in cities also transcended the boundaries of the city. So this information was no longer, I mean, if newspapers or radio broadcasting was much more related to the space of the city, the TV really transcended the space of the city, and because it was so powerful, there were I mean, the thing with TVs, the technology with TVs is very similar to technology of radios. Is radio frequencies that move through the air and we don't see, but it can be repeated, and it was so powerful, the reach of these media, that they were in the US particularly, and in Europe, in the Western countries, they were systematically repeated beyond the borders of the cities. So that is where we were in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, and then something very important happened. That suddenly we have an entirely different system, which is probably the system that we should be thinking about today. And we should be thinking about it because in many ways we should be thinking about it in respect to the way in which it relates to the urban space, or to the construction of urban communities. And I mean, it's obviously related to the emergence of the digital world, the computers, which and this all starts more or less in the year 2000. So it starts with the 21st century, that computers start creating these other forms of communication between citizens that are mediated through this new technology, and this is something that is incredibly recent. You are probably born more or less at the same time as these systems starting to emerge. Web 1.0, the first web was simply a repository of information that could be accessed. So you would look for information, you would search information that was stored in some data bank, and you would be able to download it, but you were not able to upload it. So what is called Web 1.0, which more or less starts around the year 2000, was almost like a library, like a global library, like a repository of information that was accessible by people. So as opposed to TV, for example, where there was a message that was obviously selected by certain people and broadcast to the population, and was therefore capable to change the mind or set up the mind and set up the references of huge contingents of people. This was not broadcasting. It was global. It was also monodirectional, but monodirectional in the sense that almost in reverse to the broadcasting systems, because it was people who access a central repository of information, as opposed to the broadcaster reaching to people. So the emergence of the World Wide Web around the year 2000. I mean, there were many experiments that happened in the. I think it's a technology that dates back to the 80s. But when it became publicly accessible is more or less about the year 2000, and obviously the reach was still very limited because not many people had access to computers. So the reach was not like TV that was broadcasting to everybody. Basically, everybody had a TV set, and everybody could receive these collective messages. So the origins of this technology are much more limited, and as computers became more common, like as people started to own a personal computer, almost now everybody in developed countries owns a personal computer, but that was not the case in the year 2000. So in the year 2000, still very limited amount of people own a computer. Now we all carry a computer, which is in our phone. It's what is called pervasive computation. So the emergence or the availability of computers to the global population is now enormous. There is a huge amount of people who have access to computers, and that starts happening after the turn of the century, and there is something else that occurs in parallel, which is that from Web 1.0 we move to Web 2.0, and Web 2.0 enabled citizens to become also content creators. So from a system that was monodirectional, but in reverse to the broadcasting systems, we move to a system that is bidirectional. So people can access information, but people can also upload information. People can become content creators, content producers, and therefore the consumers and the producers are no longer differentiated. So in the broadcasting model of establishing that kind of collective realm, what happens is that this information is produced by one side. In the Web 2.0, maybe for the first time, these broadcasting systems are made available to every individual. So there is not one, and consumers and producers are the same population. So that is a huge step in terms of communications, human communications, and what happens again with all these systems is that they are erasing the city. They are erasing the relevance of the location, because you can be in Seoul and you can be uploading content for people in Los Angeles and vice versa. So one of the things that people start thinking when Web 2.0 emerges is that these systems were going to destroy the relevance of cities as domains of shared information. So from the other thing that occurs in parallel to the emergence of Web 2.0 is something we already saw in the session on Friday, which is that a peer-to-peer communication emerges. So the communication is no longer managed by a single agent, like on TV systems, but there is you can communicate with one other person without necessarily having to go through somebody who is controlling the information. Although we all know that one of the key battlefronts now in terms of media is whether this peer-to-peer communication is controlled or not controlled, and who controls it. So if Elon Musk owns X, is he removing content? I mean, that kind of discussion on whether X was forbidding or kind of limiting the access of people to what other people were uploading as creators, because that content was not admissible, was kind of hate speech, or it included creations that were illegal. So in the kind of model of the broadcasting system, obviously there was one producer that was sending messages that were often legal. They were scanned, or they went through some sort of journalists are supposed to, the rules of journalism is that you're not supposed to be publishing things that are not verified by several sources. I mean, the kind of famous discussions recently of New York Times putting up news that were not verified and were in fact false. So the kind of the rules that once applied to cities, I mean, because these kind of rules of speech were created to regulate urban communities, are translated to a domain that is global, and so there is the possibility of peer-to-peer, but there are certain laws that are sometimes national, or they are sometimes global. I mean, I don't think that they are. I don't know whether I guess Twitter, because it's based in the US, has to obey to American law, while it should be maybe compliant with some sort of global law because it has global reach. So there is a certain kind of colonization process also taking place in this media. But nevertheless, social media emerges together with the Web 2.0. So in the Web 1.0 there is no society, there is simply an access to information. Web 2.0 is the first communication device that enables social media, which is that these media are so pervasive and so powerful that they create communities, and those communities are increasingly sophisticated. Like, one of the things that people are talking about the emergence of social media is that people are now into some sort of bubbles of knowledge. So as opposed to the broadcasting system of TV that was shaping huge amount of people because they were all subject to the same type of information, the social media of Web 2.0 starts breaking down in some ways these communities. So you choose your communities, you choose the people that you communicate with, and therefore the kind of information that you are using to act on the world is again limited, but it is the emergence of communities that are virtual but are no longer based on spatial domains. So you can have a very deep connection with somebody in Los Angeles, and you are in Seoul, and ideologically and for a number of reasons you have that connection. You have a community that has nothing to do with your urban location or your citizenship. And so there is a number of processes that have to do with the emergence of social media as part of Web 2.0, and as you can see, it is a very recent phenomenon. Like, the first one, which was Web 1.0, is Friends Reunited and Friendster, which are some of the earlier data banks that are, or global libraries that are enabled by the Web 1.0, and MySpace is probably the first social media device that appears in 2003, and then there is a number of other ones that are increasingly reaching more and more people. So we go, as I was describing, from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0, and then to Web 3.0, which is probably the one that we are experiencing now, in which from this kind of capacity to engage in creating content, we move to a situation where there is a kind of global data bank that is reliable. It's kind of the blockchain technologies, cryptocurrencies, etc., etc. That is one step further in which these communications create a certain reliability that is generally based on the possibility of a peer-to-peer. So the peer-to-peer model that in some ways was uncontrolled, theoretically uncontrolled, but there were obviously editors that were eliminating content from some of these portals. The Web 3.0 is establishing a control that is based on transparency, is based on the fact that certain financial operations, for example, are recorded simultaneously and transparently in many different places. So there is a kind of dissolution of the need for a central agent to control this mechanism, and so on. I mean, there are people who are already imagining the Web 4.0. So maybe some of you know more than me about this and can contribute to the discussion. But the evolution of these systems continues and is based on certain languages again, certain technologies, GSM. So there is a kind of war that we don't see because we are end users of these technologies, but the fight between different language protocols in these systems is something that is, and you can read about struggles between Japanese companies and American companies in terms of whether the GSM, which is the original data communication protocol, fights with the GPRS or WCDMA. So there is a number of protocols that are vying for control and for share of the market, and that keep evolving. So they are depending on the 2G, 3G, 4G. There are different protocols that enter into action and have increased capacity. Probably the WCDMA is the most spread now, wideband code division, multiple access. And so these technologies are powering many other communications that transcend just the communication between people or between producers and consumers. The border between producers and consumers becomes increasingly blurred in this situation. And the other important thing that happens in Web 3.0 is what we already discussed in the session before, which was the engagement of non-human content. So IoT, Internet of Things. So there are sensors, there are machines, there are bots that are uploading content also. Not just humans, but other entities are creating content and uploading content, and you know, this has obviously impact in the everyday life, has impact on the way in which we create cities. Now, I mean, this is I haven't been in Seoul for a long time, but I notice, for example, in the residences here in Yonsei, everybody has access to one of these electronic concierge systems, and everybody's ordering food through the phone. That was simply not possible. The fact that you can produce exchange of goods that is not media. You don't have to go to the shop. You can order food or goods online. Those are delivered to your place, and you don't need to be there to pick the package up or go to the post office, because there is an electronic concierge that sends you a code to your phone, and then you can access. So all these things. I mean, if you think about it, before we had mobile phones, for example, if you had an appointment with somebody in the city, you really needed to be on time and on that location, and there was no way around. I mean, if you missed the appointment, there was no possibility of sending an SMS and say, hey, I'm a little bit late, wait for me, or I am lost, whatever. You would just miss the date. Now there is a number of protocols that are changing the way we live in cities, and for example, the fact that now in residential buildings everybody is ordering Amazon, or everybody is ordering coupon deliveries or things like that, means that the lobby of the apartment has an electronic concierge, or has a place where people can receive stuff and collect it when they come back from work. So obviously that means that we need to design the lobby of a residential building in a different way, to be able to collect and to retain safely these deliveries that we get all the time. So there are many protocols, and you know, the EU, for example. I mean, this research is I made it in 2019. So already a few years back, when 5G was not yet available, but the EU was actually searching for people capable of thinking ahead of what will be the implications of shifting to 5G for the provision of a number of things that happen in the urban environment. So I mean, I'm not other interest. I don't know if interesting, but other technologies that become part of this whole system is the QR codes or the barcodes that are producing what in the Internet of Things language is called tagging. So every object has some sort of identification in order to be able to be brought into this maybe non-human communication. So not only humans have identity, but also things have identity in this system, and that identity is created by these barcodes that are attached to a certain object, and that enable that object to become part of some sort of list of objects. And before and also we already mentioned that RFIDs, which are identities that are not just the kind of printed tag, but are some sort of chip that identifies that object and enables that object to be connected to the system. So what we see here is, and I don't know whether these things are, I think they are urban. The question is whether the contemporary urban is related to the physical space or is just global. It is planetary in some ways. The Internet of Things is no longer connected, or that was basically the theorists that were thinking about all these technologies were thinking about, which is that entities, human or non-human, have an identity and are engaged into systems of global communications that are no longer limited to an urban enclave. So, I mean, these are just kind of, we already saw this. Trees are becoming part of the system, are given an RFID identity and are communicating with these networks. Animals, when we talk about non-human constituencies, which is a very trendy world these days, so a city is not just the humans, but the dogs, the cats, the cows, and all the animals that inhabit that space, and that are sometimes also given an RFID tag that is feeding information into the systems. Humans' reach of these things is global. As I said, it diffuses the borders of cities. It diffuses the human communication as something that happens because of physical proximity between humans. So 50 billion connected devices, etc., etc., the numbers that we saw yesterday. And then something very important happened in this, which we also saw in the previous session. Something very important happened, which is that geolocation becomes feasible. So that is, if you think about it, that is a mechanism that is going to bring back the relevance of the location, which was something that had been erased by the first wave of social media. So the first wave of social media turns communications into a planetary process. You can communicate with anybody anywhere in the world if you have access to a computer or a cell phone. But what happens then is that GPS becomes widely available and related to your computer, to your phone, to your mean of communication and entry into these systems, and suddenly the web becomes again local. That I think is the most important impact in terms of urban life, is that we are not only communicating, but we are communicating from a location, as opposed to, and so we talk already about Foursquare as one of the earlier portals that is starting to exploit and to monetize the possibility of relating a communication to an enclave, but it is not only GPS, it's also Bluetooth or Wi-Fi that is creating or recreating some sort of new boundary. So the World Wide Web exists, is planetary, but suddenly the fact that you can, or that you have to, or that you are, unless you decide not to give not to give your location, although the people who know about computers, they know how to locate you. They know how to enter into the system and locate you. But so there is some sort of association between an enclave and the communication that is taking place, and there is a huge amount of interest in that possibility, because it obviously has very high potential to exploit it commercially. So if you can locate, if you can associate communications to enclaves, again, you can monetize locally these exchanges, these communications. So Foursquare was maybe the first very important portal that started using agents or people's information in order to create an information about different things. So that when you go and you look for restaurants, they show you the restaurants and they show you the comments that other people made about that restaurant. So you get feedback, you get an augmented reality that is crowdsourced by the people who have visited and communicated about that particular enclave. So that is obviously a very important moment in the development of urban communications, because it relates again the World Wide Web to very specific locations. Another obvious importance of GPS systems, or the association to location, to these devices that enable us to communicate, is addressing or navigation. So these days, again, I mean, if you are going somewhere, for example, if I'm in Seoul, I don't know Seoul, I am not often here, but I need to go somewhere, I can just, look for the location, and Google Maps tells me how to get there, what bus goes there, how long it's going to take me to get there. Imagine that very simple operation from any of us now. What was it like before the year 2000? So when I first came to Asia, I went to Japan, and I had no clue of how to move around. I had to rely on physical maps. It was much more difficult to find any location, and obviously we couldn't rely on GPS to guide you to go to a certain place. One of the, I think, so this has a very important impact on how you envision urban space. And the best example I know about this is basically, when I first went to Japan, I realized that the Japanese don't use a different urban addressing system that is based on, rather than addressing locations based on lines, which are streets, which is the kind of Western way of finding addresses, they have areas, and you do too, to a degree. I mean, one of the most interesting things that I started doing when I was doing this seminar in the US was to study something that happened here, which is super interesting, and I mean, I wish we had more time to engage in this, but Korea was invaded by Japan, and the Japanese installed here their addressing system. So the cities in Korea were for maybe one century or something like that, were thinking, the image that people had in their mind about their cities was based on this kind of progressive resolution or closing into a certain area of the city that was not related to lines, but was related to kind of progressive subdivision of the urban space. And when Korea kicked out the Japanese, or the Japanese went back or whatever, one of the things that the government in Korea did was to try to change the Japanese addressing system to something closer to the Western addressing system. You probably, I don't know what is your experience, I'm very curious about this, but so I think probably, I don't know whether this happened just before, maybe you were too young to notice that, but there is a fascinating process that took over, I don't know, a decade or something like that, in which the Japanese addressing system was replaced by a Western addressing system, which is, in some ways, the Japanese addressing system is more rural, is more intuitive, is more, but it is very limited. And one of the things that the Korean government was saying is that the Japanese system is not efficient for large amount of post, for example, because it's a much more complicated. I mean, it works well for a small village. It doesn't work at all for a large metropolis. And so the arguments were not only some sort of anti-decolonization of the addressing system, but sort of political argument, but it was a kind of real effective argument. So what happens now? I mean, this is just kind of an interesting tangent that I like to talk about, but electronic navigation removes the need for an addressing system, because there is some kind of device that is doing that for you, and you no longer need to have an image of the city in your mind, because the computer has it and gives it to you and tells you go left or go right or take the bus, whatever, or so I mean, I don't know what that is, what's the effect of growing in that situation in your brain. Because it's probably, I mean, when I was a kid, I didn't have access to any of these devices, and I was living in Madrid, and I was learning to engage with the city, and obviously I had to think in streets, and I had to think in numbers, and maybe Japanese that are my contemporaries thought in coms or areas of the city, and so in what way that constructs in our mind an image of the city, and in what way maybe it erases it. I mean, I don't know how do you relate to the city, given the fact that you are not required any longer to keep an image of the city in your mind, because you can, I mean, like, we don't need to remember things, because we can Google them as we go along. So maybe our memory is becoming rusty, because we don't need to keep things in our mind, and we don't need to keep the image of the space that we inhabit in our mind. So there is clearly an impact of these systems. This is the kind of way in which Foursquare classifies locations with an ID, a name, a kind of physical location. It classifies locations based on their use or their land use. So in some ways this is something that we didn't have either in traditional urban mapping systems. Didn't tell you what was the function or what was the location, the activity that took place in a certain part of the city. But now using these mechanisms, we know the activity, and we even know what people think about it. So there is a kind of possibility of searching for more information that we traditionally had about our urban environment, and again we have access to these comments, to who is there now, and that obviously opens the possibility of understanding the city in a different way. We saw this drawing in the previous section. This is actually about Madrid, and so using Foursquare, we are able to construct maps like this that describe the city based on the most popular neighborhood activities related to leisure. So that's an image of the city that probably didn't exist in any other map before, and obviously this is something that can be monetized, that can be because you can also track people. You can find out what are the most common locations for males 45 to 49-year-old in Dallas, and therefore locate your shop in the places where you are more likely to meet a certain type of population. And so this is a huge source of revenues now. The information about these things is a potentially huge source of revenue that is now available to certain people, and I mean, again, so blockchain, we already went through these things. I don't think it's necessary. The kind of the distributed ledger technology or the peer-to-peer systems as an alternative to to previous forms of information is also now something that is becoming interesting about dating. Dating is obviously a huge source of revenues also for certain companies. There are people who are using blockchain for dating apps because you can find out what these people, the people that you are going to meet in a date, are about, and you can rely much more efficiently into this kind of information. Now, to end the session, I think that I would like to relate to let's say a well-known idea about the city, which is the Athens Charter that was drafted in 1933 by Le Corbusier and a group of architects called Siam, which was trying to imagine the city of the future in 1933. And that is probably the last coherent attempt to make a comprehensive system of organizing the modern city. And so what the Athens Charter did was to investigate 33 cities and produce a report which said that the best way of making a city that functions is by splitting the city into functional areas. So there were four basic zoning areas. So they propose that the city is divided into activities, which is something that we were looking at just now in 4 squares. So you can think about the city as a physical entity, as a Nolly map. We already thought about this. Or you can think about the city as a collection of human activities. And the Athens Charter was to some degree humanist, because it was making the city not a physical entity, but a collection of activities that they said had to be segregated. So you had areas for living, areas for working, you had kind of circulation systems, you have areas for recreation, for relax and leisure. That is the 4 categories of urban systems that they propose that had to be segregated in a future city at the time. So there were these 4 functions: dwelling, recreation, work, and transportation. Now, we are going to look, or we are going, I mean, not really look in detail, but I would like you to think about, and I mean, we already went through this when we were talking about what happened after the Athens Charter. After the Athens Charter, in the 70s, postmodern architects started to say that this segregation of functions in the city was a disaster, and I think it was a disaster. So they maybe come up with this idea, but that was maybe not a very good idea, and it was an idea that we all know that now that it doesn't work, that this idea of segregating areas of the city and making them into single functions is a way of killing the city, because then you have areas of the city that are empty at night or empty during the day, and you don't optimize urban services, and you increase the amount of circulation, and you do a number of things that don't work. So there is a kind of critique in the 70s with postmodern architecture to the idea of functional segregation in the city. And then there is a kind of resurgence of activities, perhaps in the 80s or 90s, with people like Rem Koolhaas starting to plan cities based on activities, but not on segregated activities, but on the contrary, on the possibility that you can dictate mix of activities in any enclave in the city, kind of 24-hour city. The adjacency between, we talk about Rem Koolhaas, Bernard Tschumi as people who were, I mean, Bernard Tschumi theorized about cross-programming and disprogramming. So you don't program cities based on segregation, but on the contrary, you program cities based on different forms of adjacency, of overlap of activities in the urban space. What happens now with the advent of Web 3.0 is that these traditional or let's say classical Athens Charter categories of residential, work, leisure activities are again decentralized. So the whole emergence of the sharing economies, which is closely associated to the fact that we all carry a cell phone and can buy stuff from each other, like or borrow things from, or rent things from each other. So gain temporary ownership of urban goods, because we can meet or we can search for a power tool to do something that we have to do at home. Instead of buying it, we can share it from somebody else. There are mechanisms that we can use in order to produce that transaction. But the interesting thing is that we can do that also with residential properties now. So Airbnb, for example, the emergence of the sharing economy in respect to residential functions in a city is something that is in some way destroying the consistency of the planning systems that we applied to the city in the recent past, because we can rent a home for a week or 3 days, or so it's an entirely new situation that, as you may know, I don't know how big is Airbnb here, but in London is probably the biggest Airbnb offer or consumption in the world. And so is Paris and Barcelona, and the traditional European cities are now subject to these mechanisms that are increasing enormously the price of residential in these cities. And in fact, cities are starting to react against this, because they are saying that they are increasing the price of residential, of access to residential in city centers, and destroying the community, because obviously for people it's more convenient to rent their apartment in Madrid to different tourists, than to either rent it to one family. So basically the urban community is entirely destroyed, because the tourists pay more money for urban residential, can pay much more money, but like 10 times more money. So basically the populations are being displaced, and urban governments are being forced to enforce policies to forbid the touristic rentals. In the latest case is New York. New York has now decided to forbid Airbnb, or push Airbnb to disappear, kind of increase the taxes and disable the possibility that somebody can access to these properties unless they are on the ground level, and so on and so forth. So the impact of this sharing economy on the residential structure of a city has been huge in some locations. I mean, I don't know again what is the impact of Airbnb here in Seoul, but in some European cities is tremendous. It is. I mean, there are some people who are saying it's very negative. I don't know. I am a little bit careful now about making clear statements about this, but you know, Airbnb is bigger than the largest hotel company in the world, which is Marriott and Starwood. These are data from, I think, 2019 or something like that. I don't know what is the situation now, because this was at the peak of Airbnb, and since this moment cities have started to attack this type of temporary or shared economy of residential that has proved to be damaging to urban communities. So I mean, this is the amount of properties that were being rented in different cities in the world at the time. There is also a kind of a generational difference. So millennials were by far the largest community using this type of sharing economy, because obviously boomers and Gen Xers maybe didn't have the same ease at accessing the tools to exploit the sharing economy, but the scale of the sharing economy in the residential market has already had such a huge impact on certain cities that it has triggered urban policies to discourage from these uses of the residential structure. The other activity that was listed in the Athens Charter is work. So workspaces were once part of the ways in which we are supposed to plan cities. We are supposed to plan cities based on activities because certain productive activities took place in certain areas of the city, and they had to be planned and segregated following the Athens Charter. What happens now with, again, the possibility of communicating through digital tools is that we have applications like TaskRabbit, where we can hire people for temporary jobs anywhere in the world, and because many of the jobs that are available are products that we can share also through a computer, we are basically decentralizing the job market, and with COVID, you all know that basically people were working from home. There was before COVID a certain tendency or a certain possibility that people were working remote, but it wasn't very popular or very common. After COVID, it's incredible. It's like, I don't know what it has been the effect here, but in London, literally, people are no longer working in the office. Is the most common situation is that people will work in the office 3 days and will work 2 days remote. That has affected everyone, and employers are complaining that people don't want to come back to the office. They are. In my building there are now a number of companies in London, and they are empty all the time. It's assumed that people don't work on Mondays and Fridays, so the offices are entirely empty on Mondays, Fridays, and over the weekend. People work only 3 days a week. So the possibility of working from home is again breaking down the Athens Charter reliance on planning the city based on the location of workspaces. If you think about this, all these communication technologies and sharing economies are, there is not only the possibility of the mechanical Turk and these type of applications that have been collected in books like The Zero Marginal Cost Society or Post-Capitalism, which is based on the progressive decay of private property, not really of private property, but it's a kind of property that is temporary, that it is, it's still the monetization goes to certain people, and people like Post Mason were talking about post-capitalism. I don't know what he thinks about this now, because I think these models of sharing economy, when they started, they were almost like private property is no longer going to be important, but the fact is that, for example, what happened with Airbnb is that they simply concentrated wealth in fewer individuals that own the property and were able to extract more money out of this property by renting it to different. So there are a number of theories that have been talking about this. Another interesting example of recent example is WeWork. When I prepared this seminar, was at the peak of the WeWork scene, where WeWork was renting space to even governmental organizations in the US. So everybody was relying on WeWork, and WeWork in some ways was the possibility that people no longer work in offices that belong to a company, but they share working space and they communicate from that working space with different employers in different places. So it was a kind of, again, de-localization of urban work. And we know that now WeWork went bust, or is nearly going bust after COVID. I mean, I guess people have realized that why to rent space. I mean, when people went through COVID, they obviously didn't want to go to any office, neither their company office nor WeWork. So then that basically revealed that people were more likely to work at home. So that implies that what we thought once were the sharing economy was going to create new forms of office work. In fact, it has blurred the border between work and residential, because there are increasing amount of people that are working from home, and COVID has proven that actually can work. So if people need to work at home, there are ways of making them work at home, and it's more or less efficient. I mean, the jury's out there to see whether this is going to be possible. I don't know what happened here. I presume the situation here is different than in the West, but in the West, some employers are pissed off that employees are not going back to the office, that they started refusing to. I mean, like, I have colleagues that have big offices in London, and they're saying, look, during COVID, during the lockdown, we decentralized the office, and we more or less did well, and people were working from home. And so all the guys who are married and have small kids and a dog moved to the periphery of London, and they basically don't want to come back. And they are arguing that they have a health problem, and they have to take care of it, and it's like kind of dangerous to go back to the office, and it's bullshit, and blah blah. But the fact is that many companies in London sign agreements with employees for working from home 2 days a week or 3 days a week, or so that is becoming an increasingly, and that is obviously going to affect the way we design homes, because then we need to design homes that enable two people to work from home and to talk on the phone, etc. So the mother and the father have to have separate rooms that from which they can work and talk to colleagues without disturbing the family. And so what this is going to mean for architects is I think important, and is gonna, and the whole WeWork scene also involved WeGrow, which is kind of children's care that is provided by WeWork to workers, and there is also health, and there is the whole dating. We already mentioned this, Tinder and Grindr. There are certain communities that like the gay community in cities started operating through this media, producing also a different scene to the scene that existed before. And there are really interesting cases of, for example, in Muslim countries where women have to be covered and are not supposed. You cannot identify someone, or you can even see them physically. Apparently this type of dating or this type of communications in Muslim countries where this kind of thing is enforced have become incredibly successful and enable people to share information that is not controlled by the. So in some ways, what happened in Muslim countries is that women are basically constrained to not appear physically in the city. They cannot show themselves in the city, but obviously they can do whatever they want through means of communication that are not controllable by the police, by the, what is it called in Iran? They call them the decency police or something like that. There is a kind of police that makes sure that women are covered and are brutal and so on. There are all these things, but these are and finally, I mean, we're going to talk about. So that is maybe an example of leisure. So leisure was one of the categories of dating is part of that leisure scene, but there are many other effects of this sharing media in the city and in blurring the division between programs. And finally we get to mobility, which is another one of the four categories of the Athens Charter, and we see again that it is radically transformed by the availability of these communication technologies. Today, Uber, the possibility of hiring a ride from agents that are not necessarily taxis. So this idea of the black cab, the system or the yellow cab in New York, the system that displays physically who is transporting, who is available for public transport, or what vehicles in the city are available for public transport. We moved to a situation where anyone can provide this or made his car or her car available to transport people in the city. So Uber is part of this system, or many other companies that are using this kind of shared transport portals or websites, and of course we already saw that the kind of incredible phenomena of the dockless bikes that are carrying one of these RFID tags and can be rented and used and dropped anywhere in the city, and basically people can keep using them. Ivan, did you have the dockless phenomenon here? No. I mean, this is a kind of Chinese, mostly a Chinese. I haven't seen many. I mean, now is winter, so probably people are not using them. And I know that there is a kind of, there are, because before when I've been in Seoul, I saw that there was the possibility, but it never reached the scale of the Chinese thing, which was, as you know, catastrophic. And I mean, this was just another thing. So the red light district of communications is the dark web. So these are even so. This emerging city of digital communications has its own red light secret district, which is Tor and is Silk Road, and so this kind of Rosulbricht and selling drugs or even hiring hitmen to kill somebody was something that became possible through mechanisms that are trying to erase the identity. So you can access these systems and use certain tools that will protect your identity if you use Tor. So that creates its own dark side of the digital communication city. It also happens in political processes, so voting. You can buy Facebook fans, you can buy Twitter followers. So there are ways in which you can construct constituencies, digital constituencies that sometimes are made by bots. I mean, it's quite famous and quite well known that Putin or Prigozhin had this kind of farms of bots that were interfering with elections in America and in France and in other Western countries by using people that were acting and targeting certain electoral groups, and you already mentioned this, Cambridge Analytica, or the idea that the democracy is I mean, this whole system transcend the city, or the kind of the city as the polis, as the location of politics, and basically creates systems that in which machines vote. Bots create public opinion. Bots create political tendencies that are exploited by certain type of politicians. Christopher Wiley, I mean, the whole thing of Brexit and Cambridge Analytica as the biggest and more interesting, perhaps, example of this tampering with or this using communication devices to distort democratic processes. I think this is the last slide of the session. There's no conclusion. I think that probably the biggest conclusion that I can propose today is that idea that this conception of the city as a division of human activities is destroyed, is diffused by the means of communication. And I think what is perhaps, I mean, and I would like to make this as a kind of proposal that is entirely is made like from off the cuff, as they say, like without any supporting evidence. But if I had to bet on what is going to be the effect of these technologies into urban life in the near future, is that the physical dimension of the city is going to come back, and so that's for me perhaps one of the reasons why I think that this is leading to some sort of post-human city, in the sense that the parameters that we need to consider when designing a city are not driven by human constituencies as the Athens Charter. I mean, the Athens, you think about it, the Athens Charter was a deeply humanist approach to the city, in which the city, instead of being a collection of physical structures, streets, blocks, buildings, some sort of artificial geography where humans are hosted, that was maybe the earlier forms of urban structures were probably more related to that physical quality of human-made environments. As urban societies developed, these physical structures became increasingly related to activities, to functions. And so probably the Athens Charter is the epitome of a city that is conceived from human activities, the location of human activities. And that didn't exist before. I mean, like the city of the 19th century was not really, there were buildings that where activities took place, there were quarters where certain things happened, but nobody planned the city based on the jewelry. Even if it happened, like the medieval city, there were I forgot the English word for this, the communities of people who are working on one business, which is something that actually is very strong in Seoul. It's like in Seoul, to my surprise, because I didn't know that, but Seoul had areas or districts where people making tools or making toys or making jewels, or it was a very how do you call the associations of professionals in English? I can't remember. I remember the Spanish word but not the English word. The guilds, exactly, the guilds. So for what I have learned, Seoul had very clearly located guilds, which are maybe areas where people working on a certain thing were located. So maybe you can think that the guilds were an earlier version, or even a kind of more detailed version of the Athens Charter, because it was a city that was thought, but it was not planned. I mean, nobody planned cities based on guilds. With one, I mean, I was involved in the Paju City project, which I don't know whether you know what it is. You know the Paju City? Yes. So the Paju City was basically one guild, which was the publishers, that hired a number of Sumsang and a few other architects to the space in Seoul had become too expensive for publishers, so they said, okay, if we make a city for publishers somewhere else close to the border with the north, because at that time Koreans thought that there was going to be an imminent reunification, so it was a great location to export publications to the north. So they conceived Paju City, which is in some ways an extreme case of a guild of publishers making a new city. But that idea of making cities that are based on activities or and even guilds is something that I think is probably not going to survive the incorporation of digital communications. Paju City was obviously conceived before digital publishing became and then it evolved to include filmmakers and other guilds. So if I would bet on and okay, Paju City includes a big storage that can be shared by all the bookmakers and things like that, and a number of other infrastructures. But eventually, when you plan, I remember going to the site of Paju City because we made one little building there, but I was there at the very beginning, before, when the machines were starting to do the landscaping of Paju City. In 1997 or something like that. So before Web 2.0 and before all this, that was planned. It wasn't planned specifically based on the fact that I mean, like, I don't, in the buildings that are there, they are kind of headquarters of little companies that wanted to have their own independent buildings, so there is a certain type of urban grain that is not very big office buildings. It's more like little units, and therefore it's a kind of fine grain of the city. But eventually the way you plan the city is based on this kind of physical qualities, like the finesse of the grain, the depth of the buildings, the size of the floor plates, the organization of streets, the orientation. Again, things that are not necessarily driven by the specificity of the fact that is going to be used by publishers. And I believe that over time, Pagebook City will not be, I mean, there will remain obviously a remnant of the companies that originated the structure, but will become increasingly overlap with other functions. And so if I had to maybe bet on one effect of the incorporation of these technologies into urban structures, that will be the fact that we go back to the Nolly map, and we go back to the depth of spaces, and we go back to the physical entity that is hopefully flexible enough to accommodate both residential and work, and that minimizes perhaps the distance of transportation. So it's almost a kind of nemesis of the city of the Athens Charter, nemesis of the modernist city that is planned based on functions. Maybe it's almost kind of a return to the traditional city, if you want, because the traditional city has a certain depth of space where you can live or you can work. I mean, the example that I put of the city of Vienna's policy to grant planning permission to a building is that it can be used for residential or for work. Now with COVID, that is even more important, because maybe, and there is a huge amount of, for example, in the States now, and in London, there is a huge amount of office space that is increasingly available, because people don't need office space using these communication systems. They can work from home, and they can produce, they can deliver their goods based and through digital communications. So there are many people talking about reusing office buildings for residential. I remember hearing Josep Acevillo, who was the chief architect of Barcelona many years ago, saying that the contemporary city, or the contemporaneous city at the time, requires 3 times more residential space than production space. So for every square meter, and that was based on his study of the city, for every square meter of industrial or job spaces, the city of Barcelona had to make available 3 square meters of residential spaces. So the amount of residential space is increasingly bigger, and is kind of almost tending to swallow workspace. So people live and work in the same space, and COVID has intensified that process to an incredible extent. And one of the things perhaps that we need to do is to start considering what to do with office buildings. what is the situation? I mean, this is the last slide, so we can kind of move into the debate. What has been the situation with office space in Seoul?